Good morning, everyone. My name is Gabe Albornoz. I am chair of our County's Health and Human Services Committee. I am joined by my partner in today's morning session, the chair of our Public Safety Committee, Councilmember Katz, as well as the members of both committees. Councilmember Sales will be here any moment. This is a follow-up work session from a session we had before the winter break regarding Bill 3323, Police Voluntary Registry for Emergency 911 Calls. I want to, as I did in that first session, once again commend and thank the lead sponsor of this bill, Councilmember Lutke, for bringing this issue to our attention. I think all of us have learned a great deal as we have gone through this very important discussion. And there are still a number of outstanding questions that need to be answered before we can move forward with the committee vote, but today's work session is another important step in having those questions answered. The way that we are going to structure this morning's conversation is Ms. Kondakili, who has once again done an outstanding job, not just in preparing the packet, but in facilitating the numerous conversations that have transpired since our last work session, will update us and give us a check-in of where we are. Among some of the follow-up items, we're checking with several of our boards and commissions to get their guidance and feedback on this important matter, as well as some other outstanding issues. After we receive that update and see if my colleagues have any questions regarding that update, we will then discuss some foundational issues that are still outstanding. One being the administration of this particular bill and the impact on both of the corresponding agencies. They've had some time to process and think about this, so we can talk about what this will look like once it is enacted and ensure that those T's are crossed and I's are dotted. And we also have some other foundational questions that my colleagues will ask about whether or not this is the best mechanism to get us to a place that we all agree we should be in, and some legitimate questions that have been raised there. So once we have completed the discussion regarding those foundational issues, there are several amendments that a number of my colleagues would like to propose, but before we get to those amendments, we need to answer those foundational questions. But with that, I turn it over to the chair of our Public Safety Committee, Councilmember Katz, to see if he has any opening comments.
No, thank you, Mr. Chair, and you certainly hit on all of the highlights. I, too, want to thank Ms. Saccone for all of her hard work. I know that she has other things to do, but it seems like this is certainly one that has taken a lot of discussion. I do think that you are correct. This is something, information, when a first responder is coming to a home, the most information, the more information that they can have, the better off everyone is. The question is, how do we do it? Do we have the staff to do it? How is this going to be? And if someone believes that we're going to have this information, we have to guarantee that the officer and the first responders, it's not just police, it's fire and rescue and others, that they are given that information as quickly and as efficiently as possible. So I think we are in need of these discussions today. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd also just like to note, Ms. Saccone, thank you again for inviting all of our guests today. We have representatives from the Department of Health and Human Services who are here to answer follow-up questions should we have them from the dais. We also, of course, have Chief Jones, who is here representing our Montgomery County Police Department and his team. We also have Acting Chief Gary Cooper from Montgomery County Fire and Rescue. We have Dr. Stoddard here, and actually I don't see Mr. Cooper, but we've got some other folks from Fire and Rescue who are here who can speak to the issues that may arise. But with that, Ms. Saccone, I'll turn it over to you to check in, remind us where we are, what some of the follow-up has been since our last session, and then we'll see where we go from there. Thank you.
Good morning, Councilmember Albornoz, and good morning to the whole committee, the joint committee. Before I dive into the my staff report, just some logistical things I wanted to highlight. One of them is that it was drawn to our attention that testimony of Joanna Silva was omitted from the packet, so I've circulated hard copies for the committee members, and we'll update the online packet to reflect that. But that will happen after the meeting. And thank you for calling out the fact that we do have the guests. Some are sitting at the table and some are not. So I'll defer to the committee to call upon them as needed. So just by way of background, when we met for the first work session back in September, on September 18th of 2023, one of the key things that came out of that work session was that this joint committee requested that the IDD Commission should weigh in on so that the IDD Commission should weigh in on the in fact, I'm using the abbreviation, the Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities Commission, which I will hereafter refer to as the IDD Commission, should weigh in on this bill, which they have done. And so I'll draw your attention to Circle 41 through Circle 45. Is a letter from the chair of the IDD Commission with a summary of their findings. And you will recall there were lots of discussion at the last work session, and so having referred it to them, I think as the chair indicated, we'll start there with I'll walk you through the commission's report. So at Circle 41 you have an accompanying letter, and then the formal report is actually at Circle 43. I do want to mention that it was stated by the IDD Commission that they did not take formal votes on the various positions outlined here. So what you're getting is more or less raw data, raw reporting on the various positions that were shared by that commission. They do highlight at Circle 41 that they will remain available for any further clarifications, but they did request that if the bill is passed and this program, the 911 registry, voluntary 911 registry, is implemented, the IDDC requests a collaborative review with the council and MCPD after the first year. Going into the specifics, they mention at the outset that they felt very strongly that robust community outreach, including with the BIPOC communities, was important to ensure equity and to afford all individuals with IDD the opportunity to benefit if the bill were passed. Enhancing police training on race and ethnicity sensitivity and ensuring additional widespread training on the behaviors outlined in sections 3512 was emphasized collectively by the commissioners. It was also suggested that there be a vigorous program to include publicly available data collection matrix surrounding socioeconomic and race and ethnicity status. And if I can pause there just for a moment, because Council Member Sells did raise this issue at the first work session and asked us to look into whether there was data out there that in other jurisdictions that have similar programs, if there is data that tracks this data around race and ethnicity. And my colleague Susan Farag, who is our in-house public safety expert, did some research and wasn't able to find that, at least from publicly available sources. She looked at Howard County, and she's present if the committee wants to hear from her, but she did some research, and from Howard County, at least that data was not publicly available. Continuing with the IDD.
Mr. Coney, 1 second.
Yes.
Councilmember Sales has a follow-up question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So do the other jurisdictions have the racial equity and social justice legislation that we have here in the county? I didn't think so.
Ms. Faragi, are you?
Susan Farag, council staff. When I took a look at the surrounding jurisdictions to see who had this type of program, I couldn't find anybody but Howard County, which has been discussed extensively. They don't have anywhere near the type of data on their website that MCPD does.
Okay.
So I couldn't find any kind of data other than crime statistics, and that's not necessarily helpful. As far as I'm aware, they do not have similar local legislation that requires any kind of racial equity analysis.
And since we have that legislation on the books, I think it's important that we are proactive in collecting, tracking, and evaluating that data. And that was the reason. So if it doesn't exist, Montgomery County is known to be on the forefront and of doing a lot of things differently and a model for how things should be done across the state and country. So I'd like to see how we can implement and integrate that information into how we are tracking and evaluating cases. I think it's a few more boxes to check off. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's noted. Thank you. Continue with the report of the IDD Commission. I'm now at circle. I'm still at circle 43. The Commission did express there was some concern about the ambiguity surrounding the fiscal impact statement for the Bill 3323. They indicated that the formal fiscal impact study cited a 5-year cost of $1.3 million, and that this figure differed from the presentation to the IDD Commission, where the speakers felt it would be less. Some commissioners suggested clarifying with more precision what the projected cost of this program would be. There were some who felt that the same amount of money would have a bigger impact if used for other programs for those with IDD. Then, starting at circle 44, they go through an analysis of the various questions that they reviewed. The first one is whether to recommend inclusion of a requirement for annual revalidation of registered information. You may recall that at the previous work session there was a lot of discussion around whether people should be required to validate their information, whether if they don't revalidate it after a year it should be automatically purged. And, as drafted, the onus is on people who are registering to revalidate their information. They indicated that they did address the fact that there's an amendment, a proposed amendment, to state that the information provided by registrants would automatically be purged annually unless the registrant renews their registration. Commissioners were divided on this issue. While some agreed with calling for annual revalidation, others were opposed and felt this was not needed. There was a suggestion to extend the annual revalidation from 1 year to 2 years. Some members felt that the revalidation requirements could be guided by the age of the individual. There were questions raised regarding the county's capacity to ensure an effective renewal process. The second question the Commission reviewed was whether to recommend excluding public guardians from being able to register the people they serve as guardians in the registry. And just by way of refreshing the Joint Committee at the last discussion at the work session, as there is a proposed amendment to exclude institutional guardians as opposed to personal guardians from having the ability to include the people that they serve on the registry. On this particular question, the committee, there were differing opinions. The prevalent opinion was that the guardian should not include a court-appointed guardian, a court-appointed public guardian, because all guardians are appointed by the court. The third question they reviewed was whether to recommend that the council require an annual report from the police department on program participation by geography and metrics measuring improvement in police interactions to monitor the effectiveness of the registry program in advancing racial equity and social justice, as recommended by OLO's RESJ impact statement. The Commission was of the general opinion that they supported this recommendation. There was not much discussion in the report about the details of that, but the report back is that they generally supported that amendment. They also considered the amendment at line 30 of the bill, which was introduced to replace the term mental health disability with the term behavioral health condition. They report that they had significant discussion on this point, with many commissioners pointing out that the two terms have very different meanings. There was a suggestion that mental health condition must replace the term disability. The primary recommendation was that the amendment be modified to include those terms. Jumping back actually to the letter, this is not actually in the report, but in the accompanying letter of the chair of the commission, I did want to highlight one thing that they pointed out. They did not formally. Yes, there was an observation that a number of commissioners proposed that the behavior categories that are listed in the bill at section 35-12B1 should be rewritten in first-person language, with inclusion of a broader range of behaviors to include those that are better captured, behavioral challenges or complex medical needs. However, they did not provide a list of what exactly those would be, but that was certainly a recommendation that came in the chair's letter. That concludes, it was a brief report, but I think loaded with a lot of information, and so that concludes the Commission's report.
Thanks, Mr. Coney. I know the Commission for People with Disabilities also provided feedback. If you could go over that too, and then I had a number of follow-up questions based on the Intellectual Development and Disabilities Commission's questions that are probably best answered by the operating agencies. But if you could go over that too.
Sure. Just trying to find it real quick in my packet here. So that would be at circle 38 in your packets. So even though the Joint Committee did not formally request input from this commission, they did. Patricia Gallagher, who is the chair of that commission, did provide written input directly to the council, and that's at page 38. So on behalf of the Commission for People with Disabilities, the chair wrote giving input on this bill, and indicated that after a careful review of the bill, it says, we understand how valuable this information could be to first responders and individuals with disabilities. However, we have significant concerns about the ability to safeguard this information, the cost to maintain the accuracy of the information, and the danger that first responders may face if the information is not accurate. Therefore, the Commission did not support adoption of this program. They indicated they had many concerns about creating a database to store this type of private information that could be stolen or compromised, opening the door to the possibility that people on the list could be targeted for criminal behavior. They also expressed reservation about the relying on the public to voluntarily sign up and update their addresses and delete names from the database, the concern being that if this information is not accurate, if it is not, if people don't carry out their obligation as stated in the bill, then first responders would be responding and this information would not be accurate. She also indicates in this letter that if first responders want to improve interactions with people with disabilities, the county would be better served spending the proposed funding of this bill on training first responders on the needs of persons with disabilities in all types of emergency situations. And it's my understanding that the sponsor did maybe attend their meeting and provided feedback to address their concerns. They wrote a subsequent, so the first report I shared was from October 30th, which was after our last work session. On December 21st, Ms. Galali sent a second letter dated December 21st, addressing having heard from the sponsor of the bill, and indicated that even with the follow-up that they had received, they still recommend that the county direct funding to supporting the IDD supplement, and we're still objecting to, indicated that they're still not supporting the bill, that they continue to believe that the county should spend the proposed funds on training first responders rather than having this registry.
Thank you, Mr. Coney. I'd actually like to ask representatives from HHS and Fire and Rescue to be at the table, because now is the Q&A, and there's going to be a lot of crossover here. And I know, Dr. McGee, you can't speak to the Commission's report specifically, but as the subject matter expert in this field, there may be questions that you'll be in a better position to answer than your colleagues from Fire and Rescue and law enforcement. There's a heck of a lot to unpack there, and we're going to do our best to do that. I do want to turn over to Councilmember Lutke as sponsor of the bill, and who's obviously been tracking this closer than any of us, to make some opening comments on behalf of herself, and then we can then go into Q&A if that is okay with colleagues. And just let me know, colleagues, if you'd like to speak, and we'll get you in the queue. Councilmember Lutke.
Thank you. I want to thank Chairs Albornoz and Katz for holding this work session today. Since I introduced the bill back in July, we've received a ton of feedback and had a lot of very productive discussions about this. And from different, whether it's with my colleagues and their staff, or whether it's with stakeholders out in the community, and of course with our public safety partners. And I'm grateful that everyone has been willing to engage in different perspectives about this. And I especially appreciate the IDD Commission and the chair, Dr. Greenberg, for considering the legislation and providing a thorough analysis to the committee. And thank you, Ms. Sacconi, for reviewing that with us. And I know we've had discussions, including last week with our executive branch leadership and with Chief Jones, Chief Bailey, Director Hodgson, in which we talked through some of the logistical pieces, because the operationalizing of this falls with the agencies. We don't legislate how they operationalize it, right? That's their decision within their policies and procedures for their independent agencies to work through collectively. And I appreciate that they have been, since this bill was introduced, working through that and talking through that so that they could analyze it and have any answers or raise issues of concern or details that we need to iron out. And I feel very confident that we can create something here that would benefit those who choose to participate in the registry. And again, this comes from a perspective of wanting to allow individuals with disabilities or specific medical conditions to self-advocate. It is not mandated that anyone participate. So to the extent that someone's not comfortable, they need not participate in it at all. As many of you know, there was a similar bill at the state level last year that would have mandated the creation of these programs across the state in each jurisdiction. There are 6 counties that presently have them, Howard County being the first that started in 2012, as well as Anne Arundel, Calvert, Cecil, Charles, and St. Mary's County, which you can view on the Pathfinders for Autism website. And I want to clarify, because there's been a lot of focus about both data privacy and about overemphasis on police participation. This is a bill that relates to all emergency calls for service. So that's any of our public safety partners, and it involves our dispatch center and our computer-aided dispatch system. And I'm sure Director Hodgson will be able to answer any questions about how data privacy is maintained within the CAD, as it's called, because that is critically important, but there are already procedural safeguards around that data, because that already stores address information, name information, and other flags that are placed on a particular address. So I am thankful for the participation of all of our different public safety partners in this robust discussion that we've been having. And I also, for members of the public too who are listening, all the what is millions, the millions at home on YouTube, that there is concern or question that has been raised about why this is tied to an individual's address. And that's because we're not there yet with our 911 being geocoded to an individual out in the field, if you will. So it's not to say that we don't get there someday, but that's not where the technology rests now. And so we're focusing on our current technology. And I know colleagues have questions, and Ms. Saccone, I don't know if we were going to go I mean, you talked about the some of the amendments. However you want to proceed. Some of them are ones that I've proposed, some from Councilmember Mink, and we can work through those.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I think what we'll do is, again, ask those foundational questions, sort of operating questions, and then see where that takes us, and then go to the amendments from there, because I think they'll help inform those amendments. But I did just two clarifying questions, sort of the 5 counties you mentioned, Councilmember Lukey, that those registries have not been established in law. Is that right? These are
Correct.
initiatives, programs that have been established, but I understand there's
Right.
law being proposed at the state level, but I just wanted to confirm that.
So, right. So, not to conflate the issues, the other counties that have already done this did it on their own without a mandate. The state's bill was directed at requiring each county, who, some, not all of them have them, and that they would be mandated to do it, and it created criteria for it, which was the basis for this bill as well. So the other counties, to Councilmember Sales's point about whether they do or do not have the same legislative racial equity and social justice analysis, it wouldn't even have come up if they did, because they were not done via legislation in those jurisdictions.
Gotcha. So I think, it's again, one of those foundational issues. The second one is cost. The IDD Commission brought this up. Dr. Stoddard, I don't know if you're in the best position to respond to this, but apparently the number that had been presented to the council was inconsistent with what had been presented to the commission. So what do we think is the cost going to be for this?
Yeah, I was looking at the FIS because I was curious about this myself, because I tend to agree that 1.3 million seems a bit high. I think the principal cost for this are 2 things. Number one, you need a person to maintain the database, because I think data validity is a big piece, even by the commission's weighing in. Data validity matters a lot. The other piece is building a front-facing system to upload, which, candidly, having done this a lot during COVID, I don't think this is a hugely expensive piece, and probably something we could repurpose other technology just to, reface and rebrand it and reskin it. So I don't know what the ongoing operating costs would be. I need to go back and check with that. But I tend to believe that the principal costs here are the personnel costs and a little bit of startup costs for building a front-facing website and the like. But then moving forward, I would expect that the ongoing operating costs would be quite small. So we can follow up and figure out exactly what's being included in this 1.3. But I would guess it's probably under $1 million over a 5-year period.
Just speaking for myself, that number is going to be important to me, because especially coming up within the upcoming fiscal situation, this is a critical program, and if we're going to do it, we have to set it up with absolute fidelity so that it can be successful from day one. So that is an important follow-up. So Ms. Saccone, let's, I know you're going to keep a running tab, but that's the first item we'll need before I would feel comfortable fully voting on this. Council? Yeah. Go ahead.
Real quick on that.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. Councilmember Katz was in the queue first,
Yes.
followed by Councilmember Mink. Yeah.
I can
Go
wait.
go for it.
Thank you. It seems like we spend part of my life interrupting Councilmember Mink, but she has a good sense of humor about it. We appreciate that. First off, let me ask the police, what happens now if somebody calls in and says, someone in my family, whoever, is having an issue, and they give information? What do we do with that information, and how is that handled now?
So generally, good morning, everyone.
Good morning to you,
Start with
Chief.
that.
It's always a good
Chief
morning when
Jones,
you're
yes.
here, Chief.
So generally, that information is again relayed to the officers who are responding to said call, if that information is provided. Should there be a need, though, to put notes in a particular, for a particular call that relates to that particular address involving a particular individual, the officer could request that our communications center add some additional notes in the field that would be better to advise officers or anyone responding to that address in the future, just to have information available to them should they need that for an emergency response. So again, it's generally up to the officer based upon the interaction that they may have with that individual, just to provide some updated data.
Thank you. So, is there software available to help? I mean, we're having staffing problems. I don't have to tell you, Chief, but we're having staffing problems in everything we're looking at, discussing, not just on this topic, but so many others. Is there software that could help do any of this work for us?
I'm not a software expert, but I have heard that there could be something designed in a way that would be able to assist us. But there again, it's all about data entry, right? Information still has to be added into a system. Someone has to be responsible for not only the oversight of putting that information into the system, but also making sure that it's accurate and as information comes through. So that's going to be an important part, and we're going to have to manage that because we don't have currently a position that is designated for that sole purpose at this moment in time.
And one thing I'd add for data validation, it's not even data validating that someone has the condition that they're reporting. It's more even simple things like addresses. And so obviously the CAD system relies on accurate addresses. We saw this actually where during the Arrive Silver Spring fire, the security company misidentified the address of where the fire alarm was going off because the fire alarm was in the adjacent building. And so addresses are really important to make sure that and people transpose numbers very regularly, and it's just important to have validation on those pieces, which is going to be a human-heavy activity. You're not going to have software. It can give a cursory search, but there's got to be some cross-referencing to make sure that address actually makes sense. It's a real address, things of that nature. So there is a degree of things that we can probably automate here, and as I noted, we've done. We received information of similar types during COVID for vaccine registry and things like that. But also there just would be a human component to this, just to revalidate the information that's actually been provided to make sure that it matches a real address in place.
Well, and to the chair's point, the amount of money that we're going to have to spend, some of this money is going to have to be spent up front if it's software, et cetera. Some is an ongoing expense, and I too would want to know what it's going to cost and how effective it would be. So I'm concerned about that right now, and I do believe that this should be a voluntary event. But how do we let the public know that they could volunteer? How does that work?
I imagine it's like any other program that we start up. We would have a campaign associated with it through a public information office. The other thing also is we have obviously boards and commissions that advocate on behalf of those with disabilities who would be good people to share through networks. We have our Office of Community Partnerships that similarly has networks that we would work with. The other big piece is, even within the police department itself, Officer Laurie Reyes focuses a lot on the autism community and does great work there and has a lot of contacts that, again, it would be voluntary, and so it would just be making them aware that such an opportunity exists for them. And so I think we have a lot of existing networks in our Health and Human Services Department, in our Police Department, in our Office of Community Partnerships, and just even some of the boards and commissions to make there be broad notification that it exists. And again, we've talked about, and I'm sure we'll talk more extensively about the what happens on an annual basis. From the operating department perspective, I think accuracy of the database is paramount, right? You want it to be accurate, and the reason what we talked about is with a purge, the purge would not be a strictly, the way we saw it, it wouldn't be a strictly voluntary purge, meaning you would do multiple reach outs to the people in the registry to say, hey, you're approaching your year, can you just check this box that says you're still accurate? Because it's not so much, it is a revalidating the condition still exists, but it's revalidating that you still live at the address that you registered with the first time. And so it's more changing of addresses, people moving, circumstances changing, where when you show up at the address, you want to be fairly confident that the situation that you have is before you. So,
No, and I think that's all very valid. The idea that the Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities Commission, did they actually have suggestions what could be better? Because they said that we could spend this money better, and I guess there's no taxpayer in any place that doesn't believe we could spend their money better on any topic. But did they have suggestions?
So good morning. Patrice McGee, Chief of Aging and Disability Services. So yes, the IDD Commission had a lot of robust conversation around Bill 3323. One of the outlined items was reallocating the funds to the consortium of DD providers, disability providers in the county, to utilize that resource that way, which is spread among the DD providers in the county to serve persons with IDD here in the community. So that was one of the main recommendations that came out of the discussion regarding the budget and the fiscal impact for this bill.
Thank you. And I got just one more, Mr. Chair, but the whole idea for we need to make certain that the information is updated. The older I get, the faster a year turns around. I've often been told that you never realize how fast a month is until you get a mortgage, and so I'm concerned that 1 year comes around in a hurry, and that someone who says, well, I just gave them that information, it might have been a year ago, but it seems like a minute ago, and is there a way that we could say, and to Chief, you hit on this before, but is there a way that we could say to, if someone gives us the information, that this is not up-to-date information, but we have been told, a year and a half ago, that so-and-so had called in about this, just be, as an FYI, just be advised that this is something that you should be, looking out for. Would that be a possibility?
Yeah, I think it's a possibility. Again, I think what Dr. Starr had noted is correct, right? It's about, we have there is a portion of our community that's very transient. And one of the things we always want to make sure is the data, the information that we're, for a particular address, that we are going to share with our police officers or any other public safety first responder, is that information is correct, right? That we're sharing that if it's at said address, apartment 423, that person that reported that in the voluntary registry is still living at apartment number 423, right. And we don't have a new family. Fire Rescue brought up a great example when we had this discussion last week with Councilmember Lukey, and we brought up the possibility, for example, that it's a fire rescue call, but yet there's some information that gives some concern about safety, and fire rescue may delay their response because they've requested a police officer instead. And if you in fact had not updated information,
Yep.
right, that said a new family is living there, are you delaying that fire rescue response, in a way that shouldn't be delayed, right? Because the information is bad. So these are some of our concerns from that perspective. That just says that we just want to, it's not about is the information that was relayed in the voluntary registry, has anything drastically changed? We're not looking for for diagnosis or anything that's going to change that dynamic. Where I think it really does matter about just is the address, the basic information, is that correct? Does this individual still reside there? And I think that would be the looking at validation. That would be the basis for that. So.
One thing Chief Bailey did raise last week as well was that you could theoretically put the source of the information as a part of the flag. And so the trick then becomes educating the responder on what appropriate weight they should provide to the information. Meaning, if it's been validated, so we talk about validation. So I guess as a little bit of an aside, we've talked about it. If we were going to do this database process, we would want to the maximum extent possible, reach out to people, talk through, and even like prepare them, educate them about first responders, what to expect. If they were, for example, in an unsprinkled building, we'd want to really make sure they knew that. And so to the extent that we could, we'd want to outreach individually to them in advance. Now, obviously, if we had, we estimate 1,400 to 1,600 people in the registry, it'd be very difficult to get to every single person every year. But if we could, if that validation process, if we had more confidence about the needs in that residence, then we, maybe color coded a different way so it's a more critical flag. But maybe if it's unvalidated information and it's dated a little bit more, you just reduce the confidence with which you provide that information to the responder. But then, as I said, you've got to educate the responder about how to appropriately respond to the information that you're providing them and what you're expecting them to do with that information. Because as Chief Jones alluded to, we come at this from a do no harm perspective as the very first thing. Yep. We don't want someone's response to be impugned by information that they provided us voluntarily. And so I think that's the starting place for us and what we'd have to train to.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chair, if I may,
ahead,
just to
Dr.
add to that, Councilmember Katz, because to your point regarding a year coming around fairly quickly, 12 months flying by, one of the recommendations of the IDD was to extend the revalidation period to 2 years versus 1 year. So that's a consideration that I want to raise to the point. Also to the point regarding discussions that both commissions, the Commission with People with Disabilities as well as the IDD, and other conversations surrounding this bill, national data is showing that the 5 most common situations that lead to police interactions with people with mental illness occur in a public setting. So that is one of the points to raise here as well regarding that from the comments that have been made. Thank you.
That's an important point. I'm going to get to Councilmember Mink in 1 second, but just I should have said this up front. I know, and believe me, this won't take long. So I should have mentioned this up front because it was brought up understandably by the community. It goes without saying that we expect and I think receive the highest possible standards in all responses to all calls, and we do our best, and we use that as our benchmark. This is, in addition to that, given the unique set of circumstances, but the point was made by a number of constituents. We should be doing this regardless of whether or not there is a registry and providing this type of service, and I think everyone agrees. And so I just wanted to note that. Councilmember Mink.
Thanks. Yeah, important points. I think Dr. Stoddard's point that accuracy is paramount is really one of the huge cruxes of the issue here, whether you're looking at it from the perspective of our first responders or of the public here. There are just ways where things could go. There are certainly ways where it could be very beneficial, and there are ways where it could go awry. And so the do no harm question is a big one. And I think this comes back to the fiscal question in an important way, because on the one hand, it was noted maybe this fiscal impact statement is coming in a little hot, but on the other hand, if you think about the type of staffing that it would require to really do our due diligence, Dr. Stoddard, you noted multiple reach outs to people in the registry would be ideal if we were going to really be able to have confidence about the accuracy here and try to reach folks. I mean, that's a different thing now once we look at the staffing impact on that. The question about whether or not about how to handle the data, whether to keep it, whether to purge it, how often to revalidate, the answer to that question is going to have a huge impact on the staffing question. As I have been kind of weighing this, I can see certainly why we would want to make sure that we are either purging or revalidating every year to send in our, to send in our first responders with data that they don't know how accurate it is. What value the public is going to expect. Let's just think about court of public opinion here. Once something is in that database, the public is going to expect, okay, well, our first responders know this, and so this is how they should be reacting. But the reality on the ground is going to be if that first responder doesn't know how accurate that data is, they have to go in still expecting anything. It could be accurate, it could not be accurate. You kind of have to be prepared for all scenarios regardless. But again, the court of public opinion is going to say, well, you had the information, so you should have done it X, Y, and Z. So big believer in accountability, obviously, for all of our public servants, but also it has to be like a reasonable standard, I think, there, and that's a difficult one. On the other hand, to put it on the public and to say you have to revalidate every year or you're going to be purged, well, now you're going to have folks who think that they're on the registry, that they've done this task, they're on there, and they're going to expect that that's true, and they might move, or they might within the year, who knows, but they could also just be purged off because we're trying to protect the integrity of the database. And now we have folks who think that they have done a thing, and they're going to call for an emergency responder, and in fact their name is not going to be on there. So like either way you do it, we've got problems. And so I was wondering, of course, well, how does Howard County deal with that? And the answer is Howard County does that proactive outreach, correct? They call through, they do that outreach that you're talking about, Dr. Stoddard, to make sure that they are making contact with everyone on that list as best as is possible. How does Howard County's population compare to Montgomery County's population? Actually, whoever is best equipped to answer that question.
I believe, I don't have the actual numbers, but I believe it's, significantly lower than ours, of course.
Yeah. Right. They only have a few hundred people, I think, on the registry. And we would expect maybe, we're estimating maybe 1,400 to 1,600, and they have around 400, I think, on the registry. So, okay, if we're looking at Howard County's answer to this question of who do we put the onus on, who are we going to say is going to hold the bigger burden of risk? Is it the public? Is it our first responders? We don't like either answer. Their response was to say, we have to call through everybody on that list regularly and keep it fresh. And their registry is a small fraction of what we would anticipate ours to be. So when we look at the fiscal impact and the staffing impact that it would take for our registry to have the same fidelity as Howard County's registry, it's a very different animal. And I think, for one, that needs to be included in the fiscal impact. If we're going to say that we're going to have that kind of fidelity, well, the staff that it would take to maintain our database the same way Howard County is, that needs to be part of that staffing calculation. And we also need to have the conversation, both with the public and with our first responders, about, all right, if we're going to try to hire this many staff would you rather be using that staff in a different way? Because we already know that we are wildly understaffed in all of these different areas as well. So do we want to be using these additional staff members for calling folks on this registry when we know that the majority of interactions with the disability community happen in public and this registry won't apply? Or it's a similar question to, as the Commission for People with Disabilities said, they'd rather have us use this funding in a different way. If you're trying to benefit people with disabilities, would we rather use that funding for staffing in a different way, given the limited staffing that we have within our first responders as well?
If I could just jump in and say that Howard County is about a third of their population total. So,
Yep.
So we know we know their database is 500 individuals.
500.
And
okay.
so if we scaled it up, we'd be 12 to 1,600 individuals. Recognizing that we wouldn't get instantaneously from 0 to 1,200, year one would probably be a comparable size to Howard County, and year two would increase, and so on and so forth. And so, obviously we do the fiscal impact statement based on what the bill reads, and obviously if the council were to add a requirement that we had to validate individually, we'd have to go back and conduct a new FIS and get back to that. So I think it's important to recognize that obviously whatever the legislation reads as is what obviously with the standard that we will give you an FIS to match. And so I think obviously, and the last thing I would note too is in terms of data, where we are struggling with people are certain particular positions, both in the ECC call taker positions, police officers on the ground, therapists, social workers, and others to directly provide services to. I would expect that you would not need this person to be necessarily any of those people. It would be a program manager who's calling and revalidating. But I would also say that if we were going to do this, we would make a team that was comprised of individuals who are doing things within aging and disabilities, within the police department, within fire department, that, like Officer Reyes, we'd probably form a group that was doing some of this outreach proactively anyway. Because obviously people on the registry, I'm going to guess that Officer Reyes could look at this list and say, oh, I recognize these names already from my interactions through the autism community, and therefore they're going to be called validated right away because we have interactions with them with regularity. And so we'd have to, obviously, if we were going to suggest that we were going to do outreach to each individual, I would ask that we be allowed to go back and do a little bit of more analysis to understand exactly what that requirement would look like.
Thank you. Chief Jones?
Yes, and if I could also add, as much as we struggle with our staffing, and I think Howard County would state this as well, you utilize the resources, and there's a way that sometimes we have to find a way to make a way, right? Howard County, I think they've also utilized this sort of recipe, that they also utilize their volunteers and their interns to assist. We have a very robust volunteer intern program within our police department that does a variety of different functionalities. We have, for example, the cadet program that we utilize them in a variety of different functions within our police department to get the jobs done, right? And one of those can be community outreach in a variety of different ways. And I don't see this as being any different. And I'll give an example. We have individuals that work with our fraud division that do a lot of seniors outreach, helping seniors with fraud alerts and helping them, across the county in a variety of different ways. So I foresee this as being, and I know Fire Rescue does some community outreach as well. I think we could collectively put together a group that could at least address that from a standpoint of having to validate the registry as time will go on, again, adapting to our environment. Now, I won't sugarcoat it. I think that there clearly needs to be a program manager, and there's probably needs to be some positions that are connected to it. I think we need to really kind of zero down on those job descriptions and what that would look like. But I think based upon the support, we can provide the additional support along the way.
Well, it's good to note that it's good to hear that you see a possible path where we could do that Howard County. I mean, obviously, we would want to know all the details for that. That would be really important, and to also continue to weigh like the cost-benefit analysis of how using their time that way versus another way, the same as you would fiscally. But I think that again, that accuracy is paramount for everybody involved. So it's good to know that you're thinking that there's a path there. Is there anything that it precludes you from doing that without this legislation? Because what I'm hearing is that flexibility is important, considering staffing calculations, they change. The way Officer Reyes is obviously doing a lot of this work in a certain way already, and has benefited from the flexibility of doing that in a way that has made sense for both time and community and all of those things. So some of the outreach efforts that you're talking about, I think we could all agree that there are benefits to some of that additional outreach. Is there anything that would preclude you from doing some of that without legislation?
Well, I mean, it's about resources, right? If I had 10 more Officer Reyeses, we would be on top of the world, right? But I don't have that, right? And what's been done, what Officer Reyes does is phenomenal, comparably to she does probably the work of at least 5 to 7 people, to be quite frank. And so it does boil down to, yes, we could do it, but it's about resources, right? About still having, the foundation of personnel in order to be able to get the outcomes that people would expect should you have said registry. So I think that's the important factor here, that from a programmatic standpoint, I don't see there would be nothing that would stop us other than that.
Okay, so to me, I'm hearing that this is a budget conversation, potentially, where we can discuss, if you all wanted to propose to us, here's what we could do with this type of staffing, here's what we could do, here's how we could leverage, our cadets, here's how we can leverage volunteers, here's kind of like different scales. That could be a good and interesting budget conversation, I think, but I do think that if we were to legislate something like this, that there are a lot of, liability concerns, accuracy concerns, as well as a fiscal impact that we are kind of mandating over the coming years. So that's where my head's at now, and I'll yield.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I have lots of questions and follow-up, but I'm going to put myself in the queue, and we're going to go to Councilmember Sales next, followed by Councilmember Lutke, and then I'll jump in. Councilmember Sales.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and for our chairs for holding this meeting. And I'm really glad that we got the extra information from the committees. Our colleagues also sent in some information. I know that we have our officers here, and so I did have a few questions about the legislation and questions about liability with this legislation. Councilmember Katz asked a question about, the response. And so I'm just wondering, how do officers currently respond to cases where someone with a developmental disability calls and they're having trouble? Do you respond any differently than you would if it's someone without a developmental disability? Is there a different
Yes,
method?
Councilmember Sells, we do respond differently when we have information that's available to us that would lend us to believe that the individual has some sort of disability. Officers have extensive training for example, in responding to calls, for example, with individuals with autism, or other developmental disabilities. There are signs that they look for, but again, with information that's developed, right, that's already been presented to them, then they would be aware of that and, could temper their response in seeing that when they have that interaction with the individual with the disability. So again, it's about information that prior to your arrival, right? Sometimes you'll run into situations that officers don't know that information, but there may be signs that, based upon their training, that they can relate back to that gives them the information that suggests that this individual is suffering from some sort of either a mental health crisis, or they have, autistic behavior in a way that lends them to believe that they know they're autistic, right? So again, it's trying to get as much information as possible that helps you to deal with how you're dealing with any given situation. When you have to deal with an individual who is, for example, hard of hearing, right? You then have to temper your response, and you deal with that situation somewhat differently than you would with an individual who can hear. So it's this is something from policing that we want to always emphasize to our in our training, which we do, in order to make sure that we provide the best response possible for those positive outcomes.
So I have a follow-up question. Do we have any data on use of force complaints, specifically with the community to which this bill would apply? Do we have any?
I don't have any data that would suggest, from that perspective about the use of force complaints per se.
Susan is running over.
Right. I do
to
have
join
some
us.
use of force data, but not from a complaint
The
standpoint.
IDD
Right.
specific
Right.
community. Okay. Did you have something to add, Susan?
Good morning again. I don't have it specific to people with intellectual developmental differences. That would be more of a case report, and I don't have information that deals with that, but I can tell you what happened in 2022. They had 1,415 uses of force total across every interaction. Of those, 913 were physical force. Of those, They had 11 complaints total in 2022, and of those, only 1 complaint was sustained. So the universe of use of force is really small compared to the entire call for service universe.
But we don't have any information on whether those were members of the IDD community.
There was one data point from the police data report from 2022 that showed 347 uses of force against people who were EAPed. And that's an emergency evaluation petition. And use of force is not necessarily physical.
EAPed?
Emergency evaluation
That's for
petition.
mental health.
Sorry.
In a mental health situation.
Right,
Right.
right.
So when you have an individual who, for example, says you're telling them you're forcibly taking them to the hospital,
Okay.
right, because of their mental condition,
Yes.
right? Sometimes individuals don't want to go, so the slightest use of force is going to be reported. So if you, for example, if I was to grab your arm and you pulled it away, right, and I then go back to grab your arm again, I will tell you in the last couple of years, the officers have been noting that as a use of force because of the changes in the law and surrounding use of force. So we've seen our numbers of use of force actually go up as a result of the law and the officers reporting those minor uses of force, because they want to make sure that the public is aware, and they're not being accused of unnecessary use of force.
Okay. And since we're on the subject of use of force, I'm just wondering how would use of force, or how would force be used differently with those in this registry versus the regular public?
The force is not going to be different because the policy is very specific about when an officer can utilize use of force. So therefore, it has to be necessary, first and foremost, right? And again, it has to be not excessive, right? So again, understanding every situation is different. But officers are really we emphasize to them in their training, first and foremost, about working towards de-escalation in order to, again, not to have to even be put in that situation. But if necessary, if they have to use force, again, it has to be necessary, and it cannot be beyond what it takes to take a person into custody, depending upon each situation that they're dealing with.
Okay. So, does the police department, how would you feel about assuming this, extra liability because you now would be armed with even more information about the populations that you are, policing, responding to? If there was an incident that escalated, are you okay with assuming this liability, given that this information that's entered in the system could be faulty, could be not up to date?
Well, I would say this.
Yeah.
From a liability perspective, every call we go on to, we're in a high stated degree of liability, right? No matter what we handle and how we handle it. But what's important here is, based upon the information, we want to give our public safety personnel the best information possible to help them to be able to assess. But what's stated to you over airwaves, right, about potentially what you're walking into, still, that's only a portion of the reality of what happens when you actually get to the call and the interaction that you have with the individual which the call has been made upon, right? So you're dealing with what's in front of you. It's not simply about what information you knew before you arrived there. That is a piece of it, but it's not all of it, right? And so the real, I think what you're really going to be having to address is, again, what did you know? When did you know it? It is an important aspect, but it does really assess this. How do you handle that situation based upon what you're confronted with? Because sometimes you might, have information that gives you indication that this person is really a danger and really heightened, but when you get there, you see something totally different.
Yeah.
That he's really not in that state that it was stated on the call, right?
Mm-hmm.
So those are again, the officers understand that they're not going into the call trying to be confrontational.
Mm-hmm.
You're really trying to figure out, how can I figure out a way to de-escalate if that's the type of call that this warrants?
Yeah, I know our officers aren't showing up confrontational, but I would think that they'd be on the defense if they have information about, an IDD resident who can be volatile.
Right.
I mean, we visited the center right here in Rockville and, talked to some of the educators, the caretakers that stay with these residents, and the size of these individuals who, are gentle giants, but when provoked can be very volatile and dangerous and unpredictable. And so I know that our officers are being trained, but how are our first responders being trained to collect information when they are on the phones with folks who are
So you're asking about our call takers?
yes, the call center
Right. So the
operators.
call takers, again, they are trained in, and again, there's a national standard of questions that are being asked of the individuals who are calling for whatever situation that they may be involved in. And so again, they're asking real-time information in order for that information to be relayed to the responding first responders. So they are, again, understanding and looking literally at sort of a sheet that gives them directions on exactly the types of questions they should be asking, right? And in many regards, as you go down the path that it may be a mental health, or you may be dealing with somebody who's got a developmental disability, it will take you down that sort of that path, right?
Oh, so there is a question on that screening.
Right. So
Okay.
so as depending upon the facts that are being relayed to the call taker, right, they're then taking that path based upon asking, does the person have, is this, sometimes it's just, and many times it's really just the information is you're taking, and you can understand that this person is probably having some sort of mental health crisis,
So
and
is
that will
that
take them there.
I'm sorry, is that a standard question, or is that just an optional question they may ask
Well,
given the situation?
it based upon what's the events that is happening will guide them to that standard question.
So it's not part of the standard screening?
So if it was an accident call, would we ask anybody about mental health, right? Like
Yeah.
if there was a car accident, right?
Yeah.
So that's not a standard that we would follow. Is it a mental health call in that regard, right? But they're again, based upon what is the call type, right? And what lends us to believe that this individual may be having a mental crisis can guide them to those standard questions.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if that should be part of the standard call, because it's a simple yes or no. Is this
I don't
person-
think every call would warrant that type of a question. Not every police call.
Think of it like a flow chart, where
Yeah.
depending on the nature of the call, it triggers additional questions to be answered. And so as soon as you run into anything where there's a unusual behavior or violence or anything along those lines, that's automatically going to trigger the mental health call question to be asked. And so they're basically working through, first question, second question, what's going on? Okay, you said this is what's going on. This leads me down this set of questions that includes the mental health question. And so, as Chief Jones alluded to, it's very formulaic, and the reason why it's very formulaic is because it's very consistent across the state and across the country, because you do not want individual call takers making decisions about what questions they should or shouldn't ask. And you're trying to get as quickly as possible through the core set of questions that are relevant to that particular situation.
Okay. Thank you. That's all I have for now.
Thank you. Councilor Maluki.
Thank you. So I want to go back to, there was some conversation that my colleagues have had with respect to outreach. And, as I understand it, there are certain places or folks where there might be, they're more likely to have repeated interactions. And so whether it's the police department or fire EMS, they know the resident and they've gotten to know the resident over time, and they've had that ongoing engagement. In those types of situations where there is an ongoing higher call volume, if you will, at a particular residence, are certain things noted already in the CAD system?
Yes, and that's what I was speaking to earlier, where we do highlight information in the CAD that we have, and I know Fire Rescue could probably speak to this, but when we have individuals that are, frequent callers at that particular address and maybe suffering from certain, whether it's a mental health, and there's information just to be relayed to any other officer or other first responder responding to that particular address, so that information is relevant and it assists them with their response.
One of the most common things is like if you have missing criticals, and so obviously those older adults with dementia or younger people who, because they have a disability, will elope from the house. You often have notes in the CAD about where they were most recently located in those previous. So if they go to a common place, this young person goes to the McDonald's, let's check there first. And so that kind of information is helpful to officers and to other first responders as well to try and respond to those particular kinds of calls.
And right now, let's use, for example, an extreme risk protective order. Let's say there's been an ERPO, noted at a particular address, and that's flagged in the CAD. But that person moves, and they don't update. There's no update because they didn't change their address with the MVA, because they just didn't, because that happens a lot, right? People don't change their address with the MVA, even though the law says you got to do it within a certain amount of time. We all know it doesn't happen. Or where there were firearms present at an address, that changes the analysis potentially for first responders going in. Like you mentioned, EMS might have a distress call that's a physical injury call, but if it's noted that there are firearms present and then there's been a prior ERPO at that address, that would change and warrant potentially an officer being present before EMS goes in. But those situations are also possible where the address is not updated and the individual who was subject to the ERPO is no longer in the house, correct?
Yeah, that is correct. That is very possible, and could happen. Yes.
Okay. And I appreciate Council members Mink and Sales raising the questions about response and agility. Isn't it basically now, whether it's fire EMS or our MCOT teams, because mobile crisis goes out too, and the call may have come in a certain way and it may be dispatched solely for them to arrive. After they arrive, they assess based on their clinical determination that it's not appropriate for them to be there alone, and they call for police help. That kind of agility in response is a hallmark of all first responders needing to assess and reassess and constantly do that as they're responding to whatever the call for service is. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. And it actually works both ways. We were doing some data analysis on our mobile crisis teams, and what was found is actually, they weren't coming to the crisis center. There were often cases where the officers themselves were using their individual cell phones to notify the mobile crisis teams that they needed assistance as well. And so it became a tracking issue for us. But frankly, it's a reflection of good behavior to see our officers calling the mobile crisis teams to have them come over, because they recognize that the officer is not the appropriate resource for that particular response.
And to Dr. McGee's point about a lot of the behavioral health crises that often happen in the community, not at home. Some of them do happen at home. I don't want to diminish that they do, and loved ones call for assistance. But at that time, when someone may be having a behavioral health crisis in public, the caller to 911 may have zero knowledge of that individual, and they may have zero knowledge of behavioral health conditions or substance use that may lend itself to agitation once the substance is consumed or what have you. So the determination of why the person may be agitated as relayed to the call center may be vastly different than the real reason once folks arrive on scene. Is that what happens in practice?
Good morning, Jordan Stinsky, captain with the police department. Yes, that does happen. Because people, as they walk by, they see someone acting out, they don't really understand what they're seeing, and there's an instant emotional reaction. And they provide exactly what they're seeing, usually, right? They'll say, hey, I see person acting this way or that way. And yes, just like the doctor said, this is most likely a mental health issue for the most part, but they don't know how, the caller or multiple callers do not know how to articulate that to us.
Right. And is that something that's also relayed to fire EMS as well?
Yes, I mean, that information to front load it is important, but our providers are trained to adapt to the situation and what the signs are. Hopefully there are family members there that can give good information. That's really where the majority of the information comes.
Right, right. And then I know there was a discussion about the scope of the program in Howard County, which is the one that's been existing the longest, and the size of Howard County's population. And at our last public work session on this, I had extrapolated out what the total numbers would be over time if based on our population versus theirs. But and since Councilmember Mink raised the question about their police department, and I want to thank Major Jim Marshall and Lieutenant Bill Chevrant for assisting with information in the drafting of this bill here. But they have about 500 sworn officers as of 2022. How does that rate in comparison to the number of sworn officers or sworn positions we have here?
We're allotted about 1,283 officers.
Okay. And I know that we've had a couple discussions now about training and about use of force. And it is my understanding that training is mandated by the state on interaction for law enforcement interaction with individuals with disabilities. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes. That's mandatory. Right.
And that the State Department of Disabilities has created a training program that complies with the entry-level training objectives as well as the in-service for understanding how to interact with individuals with disabilities, and that is approved by the Maryland Police Standards Training Commission.
That is correct, yes.
Okay. And then in terms of use of force, obviously the Police Accountability Act of 2021 created a statutory standard for the first time in Maryland that uses the phrase, the force must be necessary and proportional, and it creates a statutorily mandated de-escalation provision where, if able to do so based on the dangerousness of the situation, de-escalation should be attempted. And whether that standard is different depending on who you're interacting with. As I understand it because the Attorney General's office was required to give an opinion on what necessary and proportional means prior to all law enforcement across the state being trained on that new standard, that analysis of what is necessary and proportional and when the force must terminate, right, because there's a very specific bit of language in there about when the force must terminate, is a fact-specific inquiry depending on the facts confronting the officer that are known or knowable at that moment. Is that
That's correct? That is correct, yes.
Okay.
And, and even beyond that, as the state has, regulated and put this in law, legislated this, there's also been an overview of our use of force policy as we've moved forward, as we had the assessment done by, for example, Effective Law Enforcement for All. And there were recommendations that we are still working towards in order to make sure that, again, not only we look at it from our dealings with the public, but also our dealings are with the developmental disabilities community, with our crisis intervention training, and the enhancement of that as we move that forward. So we recognize the reality, and this is why we did the assessment. It wasn't just that we were going to do the baseline for what the state required, but that we were going to go and maintain above and beyond and look at our use of force policies and collecting that data to see where, in fact, we can make improvements along the way in our interactions with our community.
And oh, sorry, Dr. Stoddard.
Yeah, I was going to add too. And so one of the requirements actually locally is that we work with some of the communities that are most impacted by use of force. And so I do want to report that as of October 2023, so in the last year, there were a list of at least, well, no less than 25 organizations to whom the most recent draft of the use of force policy was shared, as well as the training associated with use of force for soliciting their feedback. And those cover everything from our CABs, our citizen advisor groups, but also nonprofits, commissions that work with, both our racial, ethnic, and cultural communities, the LGBTQ, Renters Alliance, try to cover the gambit to try and solicit feedback from the public on changes that might be necessary, either to the policy, but frankly, often more importantly, to the training associated with the policy as well.
And in the type of training that's done for use of force, or there's a lot of things that in law enforcement world, like Fourth Amendment. This is why we have so many Supreme Court decisions on Fourth Amendment, even though the Fourth Amendment's been around for a long time, because it's fact specific, and so there's always an evolution of how to explain or express the Fourth Amendment's protections. But do you revise and enhance scenarios-based training based on community feedback and after-action reviews?
Yes, we do. So we often look at our use of forces, particularly any community feedback that we get on that. We do in a reevaluation. Our training academy, they focus on that on an annual basis to adapt the training, particularly our scenario-based training, to help all of our officers, not just the recruits,
right,
but all of the officers who come through in-service training, because of the mandated hours that we have to put towards use of force. That is annually looked at, and there are many scenarios that we've based upon in this type of training that centers around individuals with developmental disabilities to help our officers, and again, in the training world, in order to help them and guide them. And then there's additional modules that are mandated for, again, all of us, for our recertification to be a police officer, that we have to go through these 4 understanding, again, the different developmental disability communities within our, in Montgomery County, that we will have to encounter. That will, again, it enhances the knowledge of all of our police officers. So.
And you mentioned a critical phrase just there, which is recertification, because I think folks understand that when you go through the academy, you have to do all the things and you have to pass certain standards to first become a police officer. But you have to be recertified every 3 years, is it?
Every year.
Every year. And so some of the required trainings that the state have, they rotate. So you have to have a certain amount of ongoing training or continuing education, like we would call it for lawyers, right? And then if you don't meet that, you can't work as a police officer, right?
That is correct.
Okay.
Yes, you are tested. It is not just merely sitting in a classroom.
Right.
You are actually tested on the material. And again, when we look at what are legislative changes that are not only made at the local level or the state level, but it's also from the federal level. If there are U.S. Supreme Court cases that require some changes in our, in regards to things such as the Fourth Amendment, we have to address those as well and make sure our officers are fully aware through the educational process, which is the training academy, to make sure that they understand the law and the changes in those laws.
Right.
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilmember Lutke. A couple of other, just back to a fundamental question. So there is pending state legislation, is that correct? It has been filed? No, it has not.
It has not been filed this year so
Got
far. The deadline for submitting bills in the House of Delegates is February 9th.
Okay.
Without suspension of the rules.
Got it. So I want to go back to Dr. McGee and HHS. Obviously, these cases are complicated and they're not static. As people's diagnoses change, as their medications change, it goes up and down. Chief Jones mentioned that there may be something in the report that states that somebody has the propensity for being violent, but when law enforcement gets there, they are not, or maybe it's the opposite. So the information that's inputted is obviously critical because it's, whatever that data is. And you have to have some level of expertise to be able to understand and diagnose the cases, to be able to, before you even fundamentally code the appropriate information. And then that information has to be understood and processed by an expert who can understand what's in there in the first place. So I know this came up within the conversation of both commissions, but could you speak a little to that? And, again, trying to set something up here, if we go this route with Fidelity, what would HHS's recommendation be on the level of training necessary for the person both to give the information and then the person who's inputting it?
All right, thank you for that question. So a couple of things. One, national studies show that the collaboration between behavioral health clinicians as well as law enforcement first responders is critical in crises response, right? And so that national standard is key. That is the position that Aging and Disability Services, HHS, stands upon. Studies have shown that works. To your point, you need clinicians that understand the ever-changing experiences that persons with IDD, developmental disabilities, persons with Alzheimer's, and all of these complex issues experience. To your point, the changes in medications, things of that nature. And so it's critical to have that piece. I think another layer to factor in is really doing an examination of the historic reasons that we have in escalating, not necessarily escalating, but an increase in mental health conditions that we're seeing in our communities, right? So there's been a reduction in the state medical beds facilities. So you're seeing more people being in the communities and having these experiences in the communities. So in regards to the training piece, that is necessary to understand that context. And then going back to the piece about these situations happening in public, right? And that it's bystanders that may not know what's happening, right? And so again, going back to that collaboration that needs to be in place with the local behavioral health authority and clinicians and first responders is also key. But then historically, on the BIPOC community, right? And what needs to exist in that space, a consultation, we need a consultant, to possibly do a review of historic landscape of, this effect on the BIPOC community. Now, I appreciate the fact that it is voluntary, but if we are to introduce this and make it accessible to all, that examination, if you will, for individuals in the BIPOC community is critical. To understand why they have not reached out historically to first responders. And just personally, as a lived experience, I've had to, in my family, we've had, individuals that had mental health crises. You don't call the police. You don't call for help. And so examining that historically, understanding how to bridge that gap. I think Dr. Stoddard mentioned having a robust outreach campaign. So all of these pieces are critical to servicing individuals since we're looking at this legislation. So,
Thank you. I appreciate that. And Dr. Stoddard mentioned that there would want to be, understandably, a collaborative team that would implement a fully rounded 360-degree program here that would go beyond just the one or two staff members that would be hired to formally input the information and be responsible for updating it annually or however often. But I think, I just kind of wanted to note that. So let me just take 2 steps back and let you know where I am personally on this, for whatever that's worth. So I think a registry of some kind makes sense because we're doing it organically right now anyways. The information and data that's being collected by law enforcement, and we are so fortunate to have Dr. Reyes, Officer Reyes,
Yeah, she might be.
she could be, she's in my book, but Officer Reyes, who has, been training her colleagues for well over a decade now and has established a truly remarkable national model. And we wish we could clone her 9 times over as well. Yes. But I guess my concern is, and this has been my experience on this body, I'll just be very candid, over the last 6 years. Sometimes with the best of intentions, when we establish legislation, particularly in the area of first responders, and we establish an initiative based on our perceptions, which are well-informed, a lot of research, a lot of communication, but then don't often match up with what the reality is and the practicality is on the ground. And so I prefer, generally speaking, that in an initiative like this, that it is initiated within our first responder units and that it doesn't have to be legislated, and that we give you all the runway to be able to establish a program with fidelity based on the practical realities of what's happening on the ground, our ability to be able to hire people in the first place, trying to juggle the myriad of needs that is facing both departments right now. And then you come back to us with a well-informed, well-developed program with a cost estimate to it that we then fund. And you tell us what you need, in a sense, as opposed to the other way around. That's would be my preference. But to Councilmember Lutke's credit, none of this would have happened had she not introduced this legislation to begin with. This conversation, this pushing for a more formal registry probably would not have happened without that leadership, given all of the myriad of needs that we have. So this is sort of an open-ended question to my colleagues in the executive branch, but it sounds like from your testimony, all things being equal, you acknowledge this would be a benefit, that this would be an asset that if set up correctly and if maintained appropriately would certainly enhance public safety, enhance the supports that are necessary for this very important constituency in our county. But operationally, tell me what you think. And when would it be realistic to be able to get something like this off the ground from a practical standpoint? Months? What do you think that would look like? I'd also love to know where this would live. So we're talking about adding a position, it sounds like most likely within police, but how would that position interact with fire and rescue? How would they interact with the call takers? This team that would need to be developed, how often would they meet? What consultation would that look like? I'm just need a better sense of, and we're going to get to amendments soon, but just what you all think is realistic and when you could potentially come back to us with a more developed initiative.
Well, one thing I would say, Mr. Chair, is that I think the reality is, we've already started bringing resources together as a voluntary work group that was put together as a result of this bill. And, we had representatives from the Office of Emergency Management, Fire Rescue, Wind Police to begin to have these discussions about what this kind of program, what it would look like, and how it would need to operate from that place you're speaking of in regards to the operations, of this type of a program. The reality is that I think it is a collective response, right? It's not the police, right? It's not just us leading this charge, you may say. I think the bottom line is that this needs to be ran out of the Emergency Communications Center. There's a variety of different aspects to it, as has been previously noted here as some examples. With fire rescue as an example, their type of responses, the information they need for when they respond to a call for service from an EMS, fire EMS standpoint. I think it was noted about even if they were respond to a fire. And you had individuals who might put information in the registry that said that I'm wheelchair bound and I need this sort of assistance should something occur, and that's information that might be relayed. How operationally would that actually happen, right, in the midst of an emergency? Those are the behind the scenes, that type of information that we need to really work through, and how we would actually respond and gather and make sure that information is put out into the universe per se. Again, there's HIPAA concerns still that we talked about, I think, in the last session, right? But again, we were very concerned about that. We're very cautious in our own mind about that information that we're relating out to the officers, because there are people who listen to scanners. That hasn't gone away, right? Important information is put over the airwaves, you might say. Personal information sometimes put over the airwaves that could be attained by other people. So programmatically, I think we have to really keep those things in the context. Again, when we talk about something from a bureaucratic standpoint, I would honestly sit there and say it would probably take us a few months to really put all of the parameters, to put a policy together about how we're going to utilize this data and why it's important, and make sure not only are we're developing such a program, but you're training your staff, right? Your police officers, your all of your personnel, that this information is going to be readily available. And this is what we, anticipate that you would do with said data or information. And so, again, there's emergency situations that, we may have in the county that, again, are going to be relevant to all of us in public safety. And we have to work at this in a collective partnership along with our other community partners to make sure they are aware of and as I think it was noted about communicating to them that this program exists, and this is the expectation from the program if people so voluntarily put their information in it. So I would just suggest that it would take a few months for us to really put it together, to put it in place. It's not going to happen overnight, and particularly if there's more personnel, right, resources that we need. We have to find them and hire them, right, create those job descriptions if that funding was made available, and B, once we get those people in place, and again moving forward with the necessary operational plan that we would need.
Yeah, this is a challenge. This is a pretty challenging issue, and I do appreciate Councilmember Lukey putting this bill forward in large part because I think it's driven a conversation that needed to happen regardless. And so this is a tough space because for a few reasons. Number one, I think we all see the potential for the improvement. I think we all see the potential for this, if done incorrectly, to lead to more problems. But I think the important thing is, Officer Reyes does incredible work, but as far as I'm concerned, she's not immortal. And so, we're going to need to institutionalize and broaden the work that she has done, and frankly, replicate it across the same space in mental health and other areas that she focuses on autism, and not exclusively the rest of the communities that are served by this potential registry. And so I think that I think we'd be very, as alluded to, there's been a work group that's been meeting for the last several months on these issues, talking through every potential permutation of what you all could adopt or not, and just understand what would need to go forward. But I do think, and I think the thing that I've been struck by is I'm actually increasingly convinced that the value of the registry would be before the call for service than it would be during the call for service. And the reason why I raise that as an example is because I think there was a recent story, and I think actually Officer Reyes may have been involved in this, is there was a young person who was found wandering the streets who had a shirt on that said, "If I'm found alone, call 911." And and that was a shirt that I believe Officer Reyes had given to that young person's family. And that's an example of the work that was done in advance to make that family more prepared for a potential outcome that could have ended very differently. You know, we also had the story of they were a visiting family who the older adult with disabilities ended up trapped inside the metro station. And those are the kinds of examples of we've got to work with this community, make sure that they understand, they understand what services we need and what the, you know, I use the Arrive building as an example, what the risks that are posed by their living environment or their conditions, but also we understand better what their needs are when we respond, you know, if they have a co-occurring physical and do we have more stair chairs assigned to that particular fire station based on, you know, the conditions. And so I do think that, you know, this is an important conversation because I think it forces us to really take a harder look at the programs that we operate and frankly build some more infrastructure that isn't so dependent on individuals, as great as they are, to make sure that we can continue to do this even once those individuals move on, get promoted into new positions, et cetera.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Go ahead, Dr. McGee, and then
Yes.
I've got Chair Katz followed by Councilmember Mink with follow-up questions.
If I could just add one final thought to that, in regards to, I think it's important to note that the APS guardianship team, we were asking that public guardians be will not be able to register the individuals that they provide guardianship for. In regards to collaborative efforts that are already underway, our APS guardianship team works really closely with our first responder teams, primarily fire and rescue. It's a case-by-case individual circumstance, but nonetheless, they do those clinicals. We're already working collaboratively together to meet the needs of our individuals that are under guardianship. Just thought that was important to note for the committee.
Thank you. Chair Katz followed by Councilmember Mink.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just want to publicly say that I too am in the Officer Reyes fan club, and candidly, I don't know anybody that's not. So, just let that be on the record. And before the pandemic, I know many of us were at events where those very same shirts and vests were handed out, and it was really, I hadn't even thought of doing something like that until I saw it. And, Mr. Chairman, let me just say that I'm in your camp as well of what you've said. I believe we should be doing something. And but I also agree that Councilmember Lukey, if she hadn't raised this discussion, we would not have had this discussion, which was very important. We need, if we're going to do this and how we're going to do this, needs to be done right. And we need to make certain that our first responders are keeping everyone as safe as possible. And that includes the person they are responding to, as well as the first responder who's responding. And if this is going to take a budget, and it's gonna, we need to develop the software or whatever we're going to do. We need to make sure that that part is in the budget as soon as we can do it, so that we can start to develop it, or if somebody else has it, or we can adapt from what they've done, that's fine. But we need to make sure that if we're going to do this, it shouldn't be even if, when we're going to do this, that we do it right. Because the whole idea of this has been that we want to have something that's the best that it can possibly be. And it's going to take money to do it, and we need to make sure the money's there. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councilmember Mink, and then I have a suggestion.
Thank you, everyone, and thanks very much to Councilmember Lukey again for raising this important conversation, and to everyone who's been gathering with the work group to discuss these important issues. Really, really appreciate the proactivity on that front, and helping to make this such a useful conversation. A couple things. I completely agree with all the comments about the importance of doing this right. Obviously, I agree that I think that this is a budget conversation. In regards to making sure that we're doing it right, wanted to note just a couple of things that I think are part of that. Chief Jones made the very important point that everyone needs to be trained. And that's not just, that's anybody who's going to have access to the data and be using it, right? Everybody needs to be trained as to what those protocols are, what is going to be done with the data so that there is consistency. So I think it's also important for the public to know and for the IDD Commission and the Commission for People with Disabilities to know what that training is going to be. So whatever that involves, we're training folks to follow some type of protocol, right? If the data says this is what's likely going to be on site at the call, fire, police, whoever was responding, like, here's how you should respond to that. Whatever the training is going to be, whatever the protocols are, I hope that can be developed collaboratively with the IDD Commission and with the Commission for People with Disabilities. That I think there is a lot of value for making sure that is part of the discussion at this work group, and also that we have a responsibility to anybody who might take advantage of there being such a registry, that they understand exactly what the result is going to be for them, being on that. So obviously that means everybody needs to have very clear protocols about when you see this in the data. Here's what the expectation is for whoever the first responders are, and that those should be developed, again, hopefully collaboratively. And then that we need to make sure that there is time and funding for the training for everybody to happen there. And then also, especially, whatever the budgetary kind of request is that comes along with that, I think it's also important for that to be a conversation with the IDD Commission and with the Commission for People with Disabilities, because, the very important point has been raised about if we're going to have a budget item that is to benefit the disability community, they're going to want to have some input into whether that's how they want to see the money spent. Now, I think some important points also have been made about ways that we can leverage, volunteers, cadets, to make this a very, minimal fiscal impact potentially. And so if there can potentially be, like levels to the budget request, if here's what we're doing now, with the budget as it is. Here's what we could potentially, do more of if we're going to be creative within those parameters. If we get this bit of extra funding, here's what that could look like. If we go, and that might be also something that we might want to continue over time as we, may see success of some of these programs and want to expand them. But levels certainly would be helpful there. And I think thinking about how we can leverage funding as it is, leverage our volunteers and the cadets and so on is smart. And I just wanted to highlight a few of the points that the Commission for People with Disabilities raised in their letter on important areas to spend money on as well to benefit the disability community. Includes supplements, as mentioned, to developmental disability providers, training first responders on the needs of persons with disabilities in all types of emergency situations, raising the very good point that training is something that would benefit every person who has a disability in an emergency, whether or not they're on a list, whether or not they're at the address in the registry. It just is beneficial to all. Continued support for the supplement, increased support for more services for transitioning youth, mental and behavioral health services for younger children and teens with disabilities. So I think that it's great that the work group is already established, and these are some of the conversations that I hope will continue to be had prior to a budget conversation being had here. Thanks.
Thank you. So here's a suggestion, and I'm having a little bit of deja vu in a good way, in a really good way. Several years ago, one of my colleagues introduced legislation to require that law enforcement go through training at Montgomery College. And we had a very productive work session to talk through the pros, the cons, what that looks like. And what we determined at the time was that both agencies needed a little bit more time to come back to us with something formal that we could react to and give them a long enough runway with the mandate that they come back to us with an established initiative. And that produced something very productive. And so what I'd like to propose, especially since we've already developed a work group, again, thanks to Councilmember Lutke's legislation, which got it going, that you all come back to us sometime this summer, let's say June. That's arbitrary, but you said several months, Chief Jones. There were amendments that we were going to go through today that really sort of established guidelines, parameters, but I think it might be more productive to have you all as the subject matter experts and with knowledge of where you are right now to present to us what you all think makes the most sense, but is in line with the spirit entirely of Councilmember Lukey's legislation and the wonderful feedback we've received from a number of advocacy organizations who are very supportive of this. At that point, we'll be in a better position, all of us, to know exactly what it is that we're talking about and alleviate some of the concerns raised by some of the advocates in the community who understandably have raised thoughtful questions that right now nobody has answers to. So, Councilmember Lukey, I don't want to put you on the spot, but does that sound reasonable to you to come back in June with a more informed and developed program that at that point we'll see if amendments are even necessary or how we want to address this legislatively?
So there are a couple of amendments that are very nuts and boltsy that are like the change so that it says behavioral health conditions, or as Lieutenant Kim pointed out last week, that we needed to clarify that it's to self-report, an adult self-reporting about themselves, right? So, you know, and thank you for that. I really appreciated that. So, you know, I feel differently about this because I'm closer to this issue and have been for years. But to the extent that my colleagues still need additional time to understand that, or to the extent that our panel here today thinks they need additional time, that's wholly up to all of you.
Well, then why don't we move those nuts and bolts amendments, because they are fundamental as guidelines,
Right.
and then we will circle back with a target date of June with a more developed program. But before I go there, Chief Jones, is that a reasonable time frame to come back to us?
Yes, I think that's reasonable. Yeah,
Okay.
I can make that work.
Great. So, Councilmember Lukey, if you want to move those amendments.
Sure. So I guess the way I'm going to do this, just for simplicity's sake, is to ask you all whether you want to tackle this one now or not, right? Because not all of them are germane to needing to be addressed as they continue work through this. So the first proposed amendment is about the recertification. As Dr. McGee noted, some of the folks have asked for 2 years instead of 1 year. I am agnostic about the timing of it. I just think there should be a clear provision that requires revalidation. I am less concerned about whether it's 1 year or 2 years, but as written in the packet, proposed amendment number 1 uses annual and then says that the information will be purged. So I will move the amendment. I'll discuss. If someone wants to amend it to 2 years, I will accept a friendly amendment.
I'll second it, but I believe 2 years is more appropriate.
Councilmember Meekum.
Just wanted to clarify, because as written, it says that it doesn't say anything about the revalidation. It's just about purging. So I would feel more comfortable if we could change the wording to say that that everybody needs to be revalidated in order to, or something that implies that we're going to do the process that Howard County is doing, that we've been talking about, where there is proactive outreach to ensure that as best as possible that list is accurate and folks are aware that they need to do something to stay on the list.
I think Ms. Saccone has to clarify, because that would be a different amendment, correct?
Correct. The current amendments that were proposed are at page 5 of the staff packet. That would be adding a subsection F to say that each registrant must annually, or maybe it would be 2 years, confirm whether the registered individual will remain on the registry, and if so, whether their information is correct. And then there'll be addition of a subsection G, which says if a registrant does not update or revalidate their information on the registry after 1 year, which you may change to 2, the registered individual may be removed, and it's not an automatic purging. And the proposed
Right.
amendment is to say may be removed.
That they may be removed, and as we discussed in sort of facilitating how that would work, we didn't want there to be on day 366, if you will, that it would tank it. That would give the operationalizing more flexibility in how they wanted to manage that, which is why it used the word may. But it does have in subsection G the validate piece, and the language in subsection F is, again, meant to focus on the self-advocacy of the participant
Right.
who is voluntarily participating.
So just in thinking through this and hearing the conversation, clearly, I understand the intent. I get it, 100%. But it does cross over into one of these operational issues, and whether 1 year versus 2 years and what makes the most sense. And I'd love to hear from the mental health professionals and the IDD professionals and get their perspective. And I don't want to put Dr. McGee on the spot right now. I'd like to give them a long enough runway to be able to tell us what you all think makes the most sense, 1 year versus 2 years, or, and that's why I think having the work group go back, but acknowledge that is something they have to talk about, I think is really important, but may not necessarily need a formal amendment.
So I'll withdraw the moving of the amendment now,
Okay.
but now everybody knows what you have to go back and just talk about further. Proposed Amendment 2 is the one that Dr. McGee alluded to, which was requested by the disabilities community, asking that guardian, as used in the registry, does not apply to court-appointed public guardians, which has a very specific legal definition. It would allow a familial friend, court-ordered guardian to register the person they have guardianship of, but it would not allow if a public agency or a publicly appointed individual is appointed to that. So they don't. And the basis for that is, as articulated by the disabilities community, is because they don't have the same personal attachment to the individual. Now, I know you all do amazing work in your department. This came up in the state legislation, and that was a preference expressed by Disability Rights Maryland and other advocacy groups at the state, that public guardians not be permitted to register individuals that they have guardianship of. So I would move the amendment.
And I'll second that.
Second, any discussion? Councilmember Mink?
I just wanted to check if Dr. McGee or anybody else at the table wanted to give commentary on that.
So based on that point, I would just say, again, going back to the point that we have an existing relationship and collaboration with our first responders team through our APS guardianship team. So we're, from a department standpoint, we're good with that.
Thank you.
All right, we've got a motion and a second on the table. All those in favor? That is unanimous. Any other amendments we want to talk about today?
Number 3, which changes the term mental health disability to behavioral health condition. I'd like to move that we go ahead and make that amendment.
I'll second that.
Second, any discussion? Councilmember Mink?
Wanted to check again with Dr. McGee on that one.
So I would just like to highlight that the IDD Commission did request that we have more inclusive language, more broad language that includes multiple conditions. So just for consideration, looking at some of that in suggestion.
So, and I appreciated that they said that, and I note that the way before the conditions are listed, it says including, which as a matter of statutory interpretation does not mean that it's all inclusive. So in other conditions could be submitted, because again, the individual has the right to self-advocate of what they would want included. That little technicality of what including means in statutes is not always apparent to members of the public, but it is not restricted only to those conditions listed under behaviors as in the draft bill.
So we got a motion and a second. Councilmember Mink?
Can I propose a friendly amendment to the amendment that we, per the IDD Commission suggestion, include both, because they noted that the terms have different meanings. So I think they suggested, to just include both of them, mental health disability and behavioral health condition. Would you be amenable to that, Councilmember Lukey?
I don't personally have a problem with that. I know there are strong feelings about this in the behavioral health space, that behavioral health condition is more all-encompassing than a mental health disability. Somebody may have a behavioral health condition and not consider themselves disabled, if that makes sense. And so by using behavioral health condition, it's broader and allows for more inclusivity. So that's the basis for the change. As in the state law, it had stood at mental health disability, which in talking to different advocates after the fact, they were sort of like, oh my gosh, yeah, we should have changed that, right? Because the term behavioral health condition is broader and the preferred term to be used.
Dr. McGee, were you going to comment on that?
I'm checking the report.
Page 40, circle 45, the very top.
So yes, they're asking for it to, instead of disability, to state condition. So behavioral health condition, mental health condition.
Okay, and then I see it says the primary recommendation was that the amendment be modified to include both terms.
Correct.
Okay, so mental health, okay, oh, I see.
Condition.
Oh, mental health
Yes.
condition
Yeah.
and behavioral health
Yes.
condition.
Correct.
Yes.
And include both of those.
We can,
Great.
and
Okay.
I accept the friendly amendment on that front.
All right. So we got a following the bouncing ball here. We have a friendly amendment that was accepted to the amendment.
Okay.
All those in favor of accepting, well, it's already been accepted. So all those in favor of the amendment, please raise your hands. And that is unanimous.
And there's one last one, which is the self-report amendment. So this would be that it states that the individual, an adult individual who is registering is self-reporting. So I believe that's lines 12 and 13 of the bill.
Okay, we got a motion on the table. Is there a second?
I'm sorry, which amendment,
Yeah, can you go back and tell us?
which one are we?
This was not, this came up last week when we were meeting, when I met with Chief Bailey and Chief Jones and Dr. Stoddard and Lieutenant Kim and Director Hodgson. So in the bill, on pages,
But where is it in the packet? Which amendment?
it's not in the packet. It came up after the packet was released. So it's that it would use the phrase self-report for an adult who is registering themselves so that it's clear that the adult is self-reporting their own condition. Because otherwise, an adult is only, if they have guardianship of someone, they can, or they can report on behalf of their minor child, but not on someone else, not on another adult.
What line are we looking at?
Yeah, I'm wondering if we should delay that one.
It's, if you look at subsection B under 3512, so it starts at line 10
What
of the bill,
page?
Yeah,
circle 2 of your packet.
Oh, thank you.
it's two.
Right.
Section,
Okay.
So it says, the department must maintain a voluntary registry for emergency 911 calls that enables an individual adult, and this would add to self-report, parent or guardian of a minor child or individual with guardianship to provide information to the department, because otherwise it could be construed as to mean any adult could report about anyone or anything. That is not the intent. It is only meant for an adult to self-report or for them to report on behalf of their minor child, or if they're court-ordered as guardian over a relative, et cetera, that they could do that, of course. But it's meant to more clearly express the intent of the bill.
okay.
To me, that makes sense, and it clarifies it, because the way it says it now, to your point, any
Individual.
adult could do it, and that's not what we want.
No, and that was Lieutenant Kim's eagle eye that caught that, so I
We
want
were
to give her
concerned about the
credit.
database being used to swat other individuals, or,
Right.
you know, we were concerned about intentional abuse of the database by virtue
Right.
of this language, so it was important that we get that changed.
Yep.
So it would read individual adult can self-report or may
An
self-report.
individual adult who self-reports,
Who self-reports,
comma,
comma.
a parent or guardian of a minor child or individual with guardianship.
Okay, I second.
Okay, we've got a motion and a second. Any discussion?
Can I just wanted to double check with Ms. Saccone and Dr. McGee, if we could, just to make sure that there's nothing that we're missing. I think it makes sense and I appreciate, yeah.
No legal concerns.
Okay.
No departmental concerns.
Okay. I will note that I also have questions about like why and how this would be, not why, but how it would be used to SWAT somebody, in that like what could you put on the registry that would result in a SWAT response? This is part of the questions I think that will be part of the discussion between now and then.
Yeah, I didn't mean it, like, I meant the parallel with swatting, where you're basically using a system to try and provide
Right.
false information that would impugn the response to a particular address.
Got it.
Yeah, it wasn't meaning specifically that it would cause a SWAT team response. I meant
Got it,
it was
okay.
that
Just
the
wanna
same,
clarify then for
yes,
the
the same
millions, I
issue.
think,
It creates the
right?
same abuse
Right.
of the 911 system for a purpose other than what was intended.
The term swatting has taken on a whole different meaning last several months, I guess.
Yeah, most of the swatting calls actually don't end up with a SWAT team response. It's just that's the generic term for abuse of the 911 system to try and target another individual in that way.
Okay,
Right.
well, I'm happy to second that amendment.
Okay. So we got a motion and a second. Oh, Councilmember Sales, sorry.
Well, I was just wondering if we were going to go over my amendments or if we're postponing those until June.
We can go over them
Oh,
if you'd
okay.
like.
All right.
If you'd
Thank
like.
you.
So, all right, on the amendment on the floor, Councilmember Lukey's final amendment, we've got a motion and a second. All those in favor, please raise your hands, and that is unanimous. Councilmember Sales, we can go to yours next, but, reserving the right to bring them back when we get back in June if we think that it'd be better for them to work on it.
So the First Amendment, are we postponing that First Amendment? We are the number one private cause of action, page, let me see where that is in this document.
Sure.
It looks like it's on page 2. Two. Or is this amendment
There's
7?
proposed amendments on page 5.
Yeah.
Proposed amendments 1
So
through
page
7.
6, it looks like number 7.
Okay.
So you're saying number 7?
Yes.
So I think this is Councilmember Mink's amendment, maybe? She's getting it. Yeah, proposed amendment 7.
You need it.
The additional amendments that start at page 6 of the staff packet. And just to keep the chronology, so Councilmember Lukey's amendments were labeled Amendment 1, Amendment 2, Amendment 3, and then starting at Amendment 4, those are Councilmember Mink's. 4, 5, 6, and 7.
Okay, go ahead.
You're on.
Okay, all right. And again, this is from what I understand. This is for the purposes of helping to guide conversation as we move, and then we can figure out what this is, what form this is going to take, whether it's legislative or purely budgetary or otherwise. Okay, amendment number 4: the personal information of registrants must be used by the Department of First Responders for the sole purpose of responding to an emergency. And except as required by law, must not be shared with any other department, government agency, commercial enterprise, or private individual. Obviously, we don't actually think anybody's going to do that, but important to have these bits and pieces in here. And so any conversation on that or?
I personally don't. Looks like Dr. Stoddard, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I mean, sole responsive responding to emergency. As I said, I think part of the value of such a database would be actually interfacing pre-emergency response. So I want to make sure that language wouldn't preclude qualified individuals within Health and Human Services or Officer Reyes from interfacing with a person on the registry in advance as part of both the validation process, but also, hey, offering them additional resources that might benefit them pre-emergency response.
Okay, so that's a great point, and I'll say, so I'm not going to make a motion on this amendment, but would appreciate, as you all, this is obviously part of establishing the protocols of what does everybody want done with this information. When I say everybody, I mean, following the conversation with impacted community and so on. What does it look like? The data gets put in there, what's it going to be used for? And so let me withdraw that one. Well, not withdraw. I'm not going to make a motion on that one. Are you good with that?
Yeah.
All right, number 5, each county agency or department whose personnel would have access to the registry, so this is exactly what we just talked about, must maintain written procedures, including use of force training for first responders' response to addresses on the registry. Small tweak to that one that we were, Ms. Ciccone and I were having some conversations about, but didn't make it into the packet. And again, we don't have to vote on this, but I think important to put it out there for conversation. We were looking at specifically for the use of force, which is only relevant to one department, obviously, but just noting that those policies and procedures must be adopted in compliance with Section 3522, which you also talked about previously, that you're in the process of doing that outreach to impacted community members members, establishing use of force policies that take into account that those policies are obviously going to impact folks in vulnerable communities, such as folks with disabilities and behavioral health issues and so on and so forth. And wanted to double check on that, Dr. Stoddard, that you had, I know you had sent out information on the proposed use of force policy back in October. Did that include to the IDD Commission? And
I'd have to go back and look, because the IDS Commission wasn't on my list, but that frankly would be a horrible omission. So if we have not done that, we will do so prior to completing the
Could be
review.
because it was new.
Yeah, I think if that's why it didn't happen, that's likely why it didn't
Right.
happen. So but
yeah.
I noted that already, and
Great.
we'll take care of that.
Great, and obviously the Commission for People with Disabilities, and more feedback the better in cases like this. Okay, so that's great. All right, so where was I? What was that number? Thank you. Okay, number 6. Okay, annual report outlining the department's operations. Again, I'm fine with this just being part of, take this into account. You're thinking about what's our capacity, and you're thinking about what does the public need and want. One of those question marks there, I think, is what is the reporting going to look like? So again, I'm fine with not moving that one, but if that can be part of the conversation, we all come back, that would be great. And then number 7, except as otherwise provided by law, participation in the voluntary emergency call registry under the section does not create a private cause of action by any person. And was this the one, Councilmember Sales, that you had wanted to comment on? Please feel free.
Oh, this was, are we back at the?
Number 7 on
7.
page 6.
Okay. The private cause of action?
Yep.
Okay, good. Okay. So we heard testimony requesting the removal of the cause of action language from the bill, and just wanted clarification on if we can, I know first responders have several protections, qualified immunity. We just wanted to know if this language was necessary, since there's already strong protections in place.
So, looking at the bill at Circle 3, line 34, the bill as drafted says, participation in the Voluntary Emergency Call Registry under this section does not create a private cause of action by any person. The proposed amendment is to add the language except as provided by law. And the concern that we heard from Councilmember Mink was, while they sorry, I shouldn't be speaking for you, but my understanding is that you want to be clear that if there is, because we've been saying causes of action are set in state law, and so you want it to be clear that we're not taking anything away that is already provided by state law, and that's why we're adding except as provided by law. We want to be clear, we're not creating any new cause of action, but we're also not taking anything away that already exists in state law.
And can I ask a clarifying point? Because to a lay person, I think the extra language that Councilmember Mink put in clarifies things. In terms of legal significance, though, it doesn't have any legal significance, because what was already there, it doesn't take away any, like if you have a Section 1983 claim or some other claim that's under federal or state law, it still exists. There's nothing about the bill as originally drafted that does that, but those extra words may clarify it for a layperson. Is that your understanding?
Correct.
And
I mean, it was drafted that way. It was not required to be in there,
Right.
But certainly it doesn't take anything away
Correct.
if we add
Right.
the clarifying language.
Oh, okay. I'm fine with it in there.
And then, sorry,
Councilmember
please.
Katz want to jump in. Yep.
So, in air packet, we don't have those 3 words that you said except. That language is not on that amendment.
It is, on page 6, it is under
I'm on
proposed
page
amendment number
6.
7. The very bottom next, K.
So the language with the double underline,
Yeah.
proposed amendment 7, subsection K, it will now read except as otherwise provided by law. The phrase except as otherwise provided by law is new.
Is new. I see.
Correct.
That's my point. It's not on this as it's written
In the bill.
in front of us. Okay.
Just in the packet only, not,
Yeah.
yeah. as an amendment, yeah. And again, not super concerned about like moving amendments, since this is all going to come back for conversation, but it would be great if in June's packet, if we can have the issues raised by all the various amendments as questions or discussion points, if the chairs are amenable.
That makes sense.
Okay.
All right, Mr. Coney?
I just want to be clear on Councilmember Mink's amendments. I know that the amendment number 4, you held back on that one, but the 5, 6, and 7, I didn't hear a vote by the committee. Are those?
We didn't vote. Councilmember Mink wanted to get it on the table as a discussion point that we'll follow up on once the work group has had an opportunity to think through what an appropriate response is.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you all very much. This has been immensely productive. You've spent 3 hours with us, and we really appreciate it. Some really great ground has been made here. We will reconvene at a time available to everybody, hopefully in June, but before the summer recess, and we'll hear back from the work group on a proposed initiative, and then at that time, see how we want to handle this legislatively from there. So thank you all very much. With that, we are adjourned.
Good.